Time is to begin. So we are starting the recording session right now.
Yep.
So good morning, everybody. Welcome to our live webinar feature today. With us is Carl Flecker, and to all of you who have recently heard us talk about this at regional meetings. So this would only exclude our Toronto group, but I'm sure that you're in great anticipation of this webinar, Contemporary Policy Changes Facing Immigrants. Carl is with us today, and I'd like to welcome you, Carl. Thank you for joining us and working with us on this webinar. Pleasure to have you.
It's great. Thanks for organizing it. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, we will be doing this in two parts as announced. So there is going to be a part two probably sometime early in the next fiscal year. We obviously would like to encourage all of you who are here with us today to send us your feedback at the end of this session so we can work accordingly on preparing for part two next year. Anyway, Raj, why don't we give a little intro and
yes. All right.
Carl?
Good morning, everybody. Carl Flecker, he's the National Director of Anti-Racism and Human Rights Development for the Canadian Labour Congress. He has a strong background in adult education and training, as well as considerable experience working with equity-seeking groups. Carl has written numerous articles on trade agreements, migration policy, workers' rights, and equity issues. He has worked with policy research and action organizations, such as the Polaris Institute based in Canada, and worked internationally with community, union, and social justice groups in South Africa, India, Asia, and the Americas, for creatively and collectively addressing the challenges that are impacting worker and community rights. So I present Carl Flecker.
Great. Thanks, Raj. Much appreciated. Just to clarify that I used to be the National Director of the Canadian Labour Congress. I took a retirement and I'm now working at Keys, and much appreciated for reading that bio. When I refer to creatively addressing people's struggles in different communities, that's kind of code for there's a number of countries that I can no longer return to because I was creatively addressing social disruption. So we're going to get underway with the webinar. I think you can see it on your screens. Contemporary Policy Challenges Facing Immigrants, Criminalization, Discrimination, Exclusion. What's a job counselor to do? And as I get going, I'm going to just apologize for the spelling of counselor in the original call-out. I wrongly used the spelling for someone typically holding an elected position and affecting public policy rather than the spelling for someone who gives employment advice. But that said, I think you might find my inputs today go beyond a typical day at the office for an employment counselor, and that's because the road that we're on is changing the terms of work quite dramatically. So I'm just going to ask Raj to pull up a poll question right off the start. Raj, can you throw that on the screen?
Okay. All right.
This is the usual test to see if everybody's paying attention right off the start.
Okay, I'm launching the poll. It'll be open for the next 30 seconds.
And so you can see the poll.
Have clients expressed a feeling that race, religion, or country of birth negatively affects their employment search? Yeah, please select any one of them.
You let me know when that's completed, Raj.
Yes, I will. They're very good.
Oh, yes.
The response rate is wonderful. We got almost 90% of votes in. And I see 70% of them say all of the above, while 26% say country of origin negatively affect their employment search.
Okay, so very strong reactions there, and no surprises either. Thanks, Raj.
Oh, you're welcome. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so are we back to my screen?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So as I mentioned, there's some dramatic change ahead, and now I'm just going to cut very quickly to a 60-second video that turns some stereotypes on its head. And as you watch this, I want you to consider how some public policies catering to notions of national insecurity have been changing the employment terrain for certain groups of individuals. Here we go.
Okay, on the second poll.
I need to certify public accountants. One senior marketing consultant. One chief financial officer. A school system programmer. But you must speak Java.
I do.
That's it for today. Gracias.
So I trust that you could view and hear that clip and hopefully enjoyed it. I love the dark justice of that very smartly produced video, and I think it's a useful example of how dramatically things can change for some at the expense of others. Now, keeping in mind how global economic crisis can change perceptions of who are day laborers and who are employers looking for vulnerable and compliant workers, I want to expand on the message of the video and point to some recent statements and policy changes that are impacting particular economic immigrants trying to get a foothold on the road to employment. In early February of this year, the Prime Minister chose to comment in Quebec that his government would appeal a recent federal court ruling that found it unlawful for the government to mandate new citizens to remove their veil while taking the oath because it violates Canada's immigration law, which gives citizenship judges the discretionary power to accommodate religious need. The PM's words were precisely chosen, as was the location, and the intent to focus on Muslims. He said, "It's offensive that someone would want to hide their identity at the very moment when they're committing to join the Canadian family." Now consider how purposeful the focus is on those believing that they're exercising a specific religious belief, and not, for example, on an elderly or developmentally challenged person who may have difficulty to be seen reciting the oath. Setting aside the material facts that those becoming citizens have already legally shown proof of identity, and that the oath is a symbolic, not a legal requirement, and setting aside the fact that Jason Kenney made the niqab ban a personal and ideological agenda when he was immigration minister, and not something based in law or regulation, the question comes up, what message is being sent that might impact an employer's view of certain job seekers? What might be the social cohesion implications for diverse workplaces? What might be the considerations for employment counselors as we lend assistance to individuals in the job hunt? Consider the names given to recent citizenship and immigration pieces of legislation. C4, Preventing Human Smugglers from Abusing Canada's Immigration System Act. C31, Protecting Canada's Immigration System Act. C43, the Faster Removal of Foreign Criminals Act. C24, Strengthening the Canadian Citizenship Act. And S7, Protecting Canada from Barbaric Cultural Practices. As John Carla, a graduate research fellow from the Center of Research Studies, Refugee Studies, pointed out, I want you to take note of the mix of themes in these acts: abuse, criminality, patriotism, and societal risk. Each is embedded in the names of these pieces of legislation. Now, consider our Canadian Border Service Agency, the CBSA. It's become a reality TV show where the plot is all about catching criminals. Now, perhaps some of you have watched this government-approved and financially supported television program, Border Security, and some may recall how this show recorded raids on undocumented workers and created quite a bit of controversy because the majority of wrongdoers were stereotyped as people of color or are new to the country. The TV show leaves viewers with a sense that those coming into Canada are criminals. Consider also the false labeling of certain individuals on CBSA's highly publicized most wanted list of individuals to be deported as war criminals. Note the faces, note the colors of the individuals. Consider the purposeful use of divisive language that has been used to sow outrage about the rights of some born in Canada, identifying anchor babies as a major societal problem, even though there is no evidence to support this claim. The notion of anchor babies, or of citizens of convenience, is inflammatory language that's used to rationalize legislation to end birthright citizenship, and it raises the notion of who is truly patriotic and who is not. Consider the absurdity and the clarity of definitional intent in the recent mass murder plot on Valentine's Day in Halifax. The perpetrators and their plan is not terrorism because it was not culturally motivated, says our Justice Minister. But killing 3 people in Ottawa and Quebec last October is without a doubt terrorism. Or is it? To create terror is to create extreme fear. Shooting people in shopping malls or city streets, I think, will create that effect. Perhaps the country of origin, the faces and color of some versus others makes it easier to determine who is a terrorist and who is merely a suspected murderer. Now, perhaps if we all spent time hiding in a closet in Parliament during attacks by individuals with mental health issues, making such distinctions would make perfect sense. Consider the decision by the PMO to attack and defame the National Council of Canadian Muslims, the NCCM, implying this organization has ties to Hamas. Or the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, John Baird, saying, and I quote, I'd encourage any Canadian to Google the group in question and to do some research on their own and come to their own conclusions. Now this fellow, Omar Aziz, a Pitt scholar from Cambridge University, took John Baird's suggestion to heart, and he did extensive research and pointed out that the only so-called link between today's National Council of Canadian Muslims and Hamas is that an earlier incarnation of NCCM was loosely tied to an organization that was founded by 3 individuals from another organization 2 decades ago that at that time had links to Hamas. An important point here is a U.S. federal court judge acknowledged that this so-called link predates when Hamas was actually designated a terrorist organization. So the NCCM, in truth, does not have a current or meaningful link to Hamas. Now, if this absurd chain of guilt by association is confusing, it should be. It's the equivalent of calling someone a racist today because they knew someone who was a racist 20 years ago. This disconnected drivel is what we would expect from the likes of Sarah Palin, trying to take a racist wedge, politically motivated potshot at Barack Obama. Yet we see the same tactic used here. The example that I'm giving here, though, does something very effectively. It smears a national organization representing all Muslims in Canada. It dehumanizes and it criminalizes an entire group of people who are job seekers. Now, consider these quotes from the former minister Jason Kenney from a single article about his perception of problems with our refugee system that was published in 2009. You can read the quotes. These examples that I'm presenting undoubtedly contribute to an unwelcoming social climate that certain economic immigrants endure as they try to access the labor market. Now, Maclean's magazine asked a very important question on their cover page back in 2007. You should see it there. The question is quite relevant and valid today. Are we becoming a nation of bigots? Now, I'm sure you're familiar with this study by Professor Oreopoulos and Diane DeChief on the role your name can play in the job search. The professor originally conducted his study in 2009, and he focused it on employers in the Toronto area reacting to so-called ethnic-sounding names. In 2011, Oreopoulos and DeChief expanded their study to assess how employers responded to resumes in the Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver cities, all cities with high concentrations of immigrants. The researchers sent employers close to 8,000 randomly created resumes for various job postings in the 3 cities. The jobs that they required at least a bachelor's degree and 4 to 6 years of work experience. All of the resumes they sent demonstrated the job requirements were met with either Canadian or international work experience. The twist in their research was that some of the CVs had Anglophone names such as Jill Smith, while others had Greek, Indian, or Chinese names such as Lucas Minnesopoulos or Yong Shang. The results? Well, job seekers with common Anglophone names such as Greg Brown on their resumes got more responses from employers in these 3 largest cities than applicants with names that are not so Anglo-sounding. The researchers found that people with Greek, Chinese, and Indian names were less likely to hear back from employers, even for applicants with Canadian education and Canadian experience. The result is concerning because the difference is generated from a name, Mr. Oreopoulos said. The second part of that research, which I found quite fascinating, was they actually asked human resource professionals why they think people with so-called foreign-sounding names are less likely to be contacted for an interview. The HR people typically cited perceived concern over language or social skills, a response that contradicts the fact that many resumes clearly cited Canadian experience and fluency in English and French. Quote, subconscious discrimination may explain why immigrants with foreign-sounding names get lower callback rates, Oreopoulos said. Now, I started off this webinar giving a few examples of policy statements and legislation that implies linkages between immigrants and criminality, or queue jumping, or gaming the system, or high-level statements that equate certain people as being synonymous with terrorists, or immigration ministers who suggest that cultural or religious practices that differ is the same as being unpatriotic. It should not be a surprise that those actions, alongside banners that read "Zero tolerance for culturally barbaric practices," will contribute to subconscious discrimination targeting certain job seekers. Now, I suspect that none of this is news to you, nor is it just a recent set of examples. Following the tragic events of September 11, 2001, and the subsequent hasty introduction and passage of a 186-page Anti-Terrorism Act, the first one, here's what happened in workplaces across this country. Now, these are just a few examples from a report that I wrote affecting workers, and I presented it to the Senate committee who were reviewing the ATA, the Anti-Terrorism Act. I'm sharing it now because it's relevant today, because ATA version 2 is about to be passed, and it will certainly affect newcomers profoundly. But back then, rumors were circulated in one workplace targeting a specific Muslim workmate, alleging that he had lost his workers' compensation benefits because of links with terrorists. Truck drivers with Arabic ancestry or Arabic-sounding names were removed by their employers from the U.S.-Canada cross-border routes because they were subjected to prolonged delays and intensive investigations by border security. It cost the trucking companies downtime and money. Those workers were reassigned and faced reduced shifts and were ostracized by their colleagues. The Muslim Lawyers Association conducted a survey of the impacts of the Anti-Terrorism Act in 2004. 10 out of 40 lawyers interviewed identified 35 cases of workplace racial profiling, 6 cases of wrongful dismissal, 16 cases of security forces visiting workplaces to question employees and harassment by officials, 7 cases of hostility or inaction by the police, and 6 immigration-related incidents. That was the first Anti-Terrorism Act. The second goes much further. Now, in the airline sector, there were some concerns dating back to '85 after the Air India bombing. A hastily conceived and flawed security system was put in place at airports. According to the Air Transport Association of Canada, as many as 1,000 airline employees, some of these longtime workers with impeccable records, were unable to obtain security clearances they needed to work due to a flawed system of gaining the clearances. Those most directly affected were individuals whose country of origin was not Canada, or who had spent time abroad. To obtain an airport security pass, anyone who lived outside of Canada for more than 3 months in the previous 5 years had to provide documentation from police or security services from that country. Now that can be a really slow process, and in some cases impossible, since police forces in some countries just flatly refuse to cooperate. As well, if someone is refused a security clearance, there was no genuine appeals procedure. The marine sector is another example. A similar security clearance program was put in place courtesy of Transport Canada for marine industry workers. Now, if you want to work on the docks and in designated areas where the job and the pay is much better, you must obtain something called a marine transport security clearance. However, this security clearance process targets individuals who are either dual citizens who have spent time in countries on a list of what's called rogue countries or prescribed countries designated by Canada and the U.S. That security clearance process allows for an extreme invasion into an individual's privacy. Not only is the life of the individual who needs the clearance to work on the docks exposed to the investigations of the RCMP and members of CSIS, but so are the lives of their spouses, their parents, their spouses' parents, ex-spouses, other family members, and close friends. Background checks are done that go beyond a criminal police check. They involve security personnel and information that is shared with the national police and security agencies of the source country, including information that can put families at risk who are still living in those source countries. The level of clearance required for a person driving a forklift on a dock is just short of the top security level clearance required by those conducting the investigations into the workers' lives. Now, the International Longshore Workers Unions, Legal Beagles, their department, had this to say about the inherent flaws in the Marine Transport Security Clearance Program, which still operates to this day. It requires an invasive questions about a number of matters, including country of origin and city of birth, requires the employee to disclose that they have a passport, and if so, the passport number, which of course leads to cross-checking for additional information. It requires information about whether or not the employee attended post-secondary institution, and if so, what institution and when. It requires all of the addresses the employee may have lived at for the past 5 years. Requires listing of specific activities for the past 5 years, such as school, previous employment, all travel with stays in countries for more than 90 days during the last 5 years, and whether an employee has a criminal conviction, and information about an employee's spouse. This Marine Transport Security Clearance form for these workers requires the employee to consent to the release of the information contained on the form to governments of countries that he or she may have lived in or traveled to. If consent to disclose is not given, the security clearance will not be granted and the employee will not be able to work in the designated area. The information on these forms is disclosed to the RCMP, to law enforcement agencies generally, to CSIS, to other governments generally, and to virtually anyone or any other institution that Transport Canada may wish to contact to investigate the employees. Further, the form states that the Transport Canada can disclose personal information collected to former employers, schools, landlords of employees to verify the information. For individuals who fled countries due to persecution or may have had family members still living in such countries, this level of inquiry and information sharing can have very serious consequences. If you fail to comply, no security clearance, and you're constrained in your ability to work on the docks. For the ILWU, that meant that its membership, which is composed of 40% of individuals who are immigrants or persons with dual citizenship, that's a pretty serious implication. And of course, obviously, it would limit opportunities for newcomers into Canada. Now, These are measures that are increasingly being replicated into more and more sectors of the economy. The manufacturing sector, for example. Canadians and permanent residents employed in the manufacturing sector of what are deemed controlled goods, and the definition of that's on your screen, that cross the U.S. or Canada border are subjected to stringent security requirements. The Custom and Trade Partnership Against Terrorists, or CTPAT, of the U.S. Customs Border Protection Services forces Canadian manufacturers to set up measures in order to trace not only the origin of all exported goods, but also to identify every single employee who has handled those products. Think about that for a second. The U.S. government can prevent workers who hold dual citizenship with 20-some countries from working on U.S. military contracts awarded to manufacturers in Canada, and the rule is called ITAR, which is an acronym for International Traffic in Arms Regulation. Now, I'll just turn to Raj, and we have a question, a survey question. I'll ask you to throw that up on the screen. Do you have clients who are from these countries? Go ahead, Raj.
All right. It's on now.
I'll just read the list of countries as it's up there: Afghanistan, Belarus, Burma, China, Cuba, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Liberia, Libya, North Korea, Rwanda, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, and Vietnam.
As usual.
I imagine everybody's got somebody from...
You know what, Carl? You wish, like, we have poll percentages like that for the federal elections, It's almost 80% and going.
I knew if I had a math guy on this, he would make the connection.
All right, so it's about a minute, and I'm going to close the polls. Give it a couple more seconds. All right, I'm closing it now, folks. So let's see what we have here. That's the result. Do you see that, Carl?
No, I can't see it, but go ahead, tell me.
Okay. 94% people work with people from Afghanistan, Belarus, Burma, China, and Cuba. Almost 90% people say that they work with Republic of Congo, Haiti, Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon. About 59% of people work with people from Liberia, Libya, North Korea, Rwanda, or Somalia. And about 71% of them work with people from Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, or Vietnam.
Okay, thanks, Raj.
All right.
So it's pretty clear that just from 19-20 countries, this has a profound impact on whom we're seeing. We'll go back to my screen.
Yes, you are.
Okay, that's that list of countries there. So this ITAR rule leads to discrimination against not only Canadian citizens, but also obviously the permanent residents born in these countries. Okay? So under this rule, Canadian residents, including citizens born in these countries, are denied access to all data, products, and services regulated by ITAR, regardless how long the person may have lived in Canada. And employment-related access is only permitted if individuals comply and pass the security protocols designated under Canada's Controlled Goods Program. Now, to give you a sense of how this affects job seekers and those employed, consider that after 9/11, 6 workers, all Canadian citizens or landed immigrants who held citizenship status from other countries, were sent home from their workplace at a GM plant that manufactured military vehicles for various governments, including the U.S. GM called those workers to a meeting and sent them home without pay because of their status. The employees were later returned to work, but GM did not apply for security clearances for them, so they faced restrictions on access to information required to do their jobs or had to perform alternate duties. The workers took their case of workplace discrimination based on citizenship and place of origin to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and settlement with GM was finally reached in July of 2007. GM agreed to pay an undisclosed amount of cash to each of the 6 employees and agreed in future to make all reasonable efforts to secure proper security clearances as necessary so the workers could do their jobs and differential treatment was minimized. But stop and think about the impact on those workers in that workplace and their neighbors and in the community during that period when they were sent home because they didn't pass a security clearance. Just to give you a quick sense here, here is what one senior official with the United States State Department said about such cases. And I love this quote. "We don't care if you win a lawsuit. We don't care if the ITAR causes good Canadian companies to violate Canadian laws. We aren't changing the ITAR." That's a pretty clear message. As a result of ITAR, there have been reports of Canadian engineers and technicians who worked for years with dedication to their professions, and employers who are now subject to practices of segregation, isolation, and increased surveillance simply because of where the worker was born from one of the prescribed countries. Imagine how difficult it will be to get a job in this if your country of origin collides with ITAR and the controlled goods program. Now, OCASI, the Metro Chinese and Southeast and South Asian legal clinics of Ontario filed a report with the UN's committee tasked with monitoring member states' commitment to upholding the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, short form known as CERD. These agencies cited serious problems that remain a concern to this day with ITAR. Many employees have since December 2006 had their access to different sections of plants terminated because it is ITAR restricted. Some employees were physically displaced from their usual workplaces so that they're away from the area where the ITAR-related contract is performed. Some employees were told that there will be deals for early departures, transfer to other companies, and layoffs, although these deals were not put in writing and no written details were given to employees. An aerospace industry worker in Montreal was told he would have to revoke his Lebanese citizenship in order to qualify a position in a private sector workplace that was working on a U.S. military contract. And in another case, a Venezuelan-born aerospace worker, Jamie Vargas, 52 years of age, father of 4, challenged the ITAR rule by filing a human rights complaint stating the discrimination of employment opportunities because of his birthplace. And I just heard from Phonemi in Montreal that this case was just recently settled. This was back in 2007. His statement cites, among other examples, occasions where he and another intern working at Bell Helicopter Textron were not shown a computer program due to ITAR rules. Current industry employees, students in local educational institutions such as McGill, Concordia, École Polytechnique, who were born in the prescribed countries, experienced difficulties finding internships, accessing curriculum information in their classes, and obtaining employment upon graduation. Conflict between Canadian human rights legislation and former ITAR dual national rule has been costing Canadian companies millions of dollars in lost business opportunities and in settling human rights complaints. Because the U.S. would not alter ITAR, Canada developed its own protocols that the government says now focus on security rather than nationality. And quickly, essentially, manufacturers or contractors and their suppliers who are dealing with controlled goods and where these goods are exported into the U.S., the controlled goods program requires Canadian residents working in these sectors to obtain a security clearance if they want employment. I want to note here that security clearances are required for anyone working in the controlled goods sector, as well as anyone who wants to work with the federal government or a Crown agency, such as Canada Post. There are different levels of security clearances. One's called reliability status, confidential status, secret, and top secret. The most common levels for any federal government employee are reliability status and secret. Here's an interesting thing. The general wait times to obtain the reliability status level is 2 to 8 weeks, provided an out-of-country check and or fingerprints are not required. Delays occur if you've lived outside of Canada within the past 5 years, and then the wait time can increase to over 1 year. You can't initiate an application in advance because the process can only be initiated by a designated company security officer of the place where you want to work, and that only happens after you've applied for a position and are being considered for employment. So newcomers to Canada, of course, are eligible, but they must be a resident of Canada for the past 5 years and hold a valid PR or citizenship. If you don't meet these criteria, Of course, it's still possible to get a clearance, but access to information in the workplace will be limited. So again, I return to what will be the impact on those workers. Now imagine you're a digital telecommunications specialist with educational training and relevant work experience from Iran, your birth country. Chances of getting an ITAR clearance and the CGP security clearance are going to be affected by the delays noted on your screen. Now, given that there are only a few telecommunication companies in Canada, such as this one, Telsat, and I went online last night, and this is a current job posting. The prospect, this is for a systems engineering specialist in Ottawa. You can see here, this job post requires, and we'll just zoom down to the bottom, ITAR approval and CG clearance. I'm wondering which employer is going to wait a year or longer for somebody to get that. I think you can see that despite the claim that this process focuses on security rather than nationality, those facing longer wait times are precisely persons who have a lived experience out of the country and or newcomers to Canada. So, nationality. To repeat, the security clearance is not just for folks who want to work in areas involving controlled goods. Working with the federal government at any level requires obtaining a security clearance. And governments are significant employers. There's various internship pathways with various federal and provincial governments that can be useful for economic immigrants seeking to put their skills and international experience to work in the public sector. Yet these rules likely affect them in a systemically discriminatory manner. The same challenges will be faced by those who have lived experience elsewhere or who hold dual citizenship, particularly with select countries where the Canadian government raises questions about that state's role with terrorist organizations. Of course, this is not to say newcomers will not be able to work in the public service in Canada. But in order to secure employment, individuals are going to have to address security concerns. Now, Bill C-51 is going to change everything, because the playing field for security clearance will be profoundly and affected in an unprecedented manner. Daniel Theron, the Privacy Commissioner for Canada, has pointed out that this bill, as it's currently written, allows departments and agencies to share the personal information of all individuals, including ordinary Canadians, permanent residents, refugees, those on work permits, anyone. The information sharing provisions are not limited to suspicion of terrorist activities. Rather, the purpose is to allow for the detection and identification of any new security threat. A specific area of concern already identified by Canada's national security establishment, the CBSA, the Canadian Security Establishment, the RCMP, CSIS, and a host of other joint intelligence anti-terror units, is to investigate with far greater powers and latitude outside of parliamentary oversight anyone who is suspected of playing a role in perhaps facilitating homegrown terrorism. Who do you think will be the primary targets of this element of the information sharing provisions of Bill C-51? Now, here are a few names and faces of some Canadian residents who've been caught up in the aftermath of the first Anti-Terrorism Act, the safer one. They have not been able, none of these individuals have been able to seek employment, and few will have been very lucky if they ever secure employment, meaningful employment, given that their names and reputations have been thoroughly maligned. Outside of Mahar and his $11 million settlement, the rest are not doing so good. I could ask here if you see what these individuals have in common, but I think it's fairly evident. Consider the implications of what is to come with Bill C-51. Anyone, including clients that are permanent residents seeking employment with the federal government, or with a manufacturer serving the U.S. or Canadian military, or with the aerospace sector, or with the telecommunications sector, or any supply chain provider, or anyone seeking employment with our rail system, oil and gas industry. Will anyone whose employment may be linked with activity that undermines the security of Canada will be subjected to the provisions of Bill C-51. I've put a few excerpts of the bill on the screen to show you how pervasive this scope of scrutiny will take. Professors Kent Roach and Craig Forsey have done perhaps the most detailed and exhaustive analysis of this bill, and particularly the expanded information sharing provisions, note three important concerns. First, the bill permits information sharing across government for an incredibly wide range of purposes, most of which have nothing to do with terrorism. To quote Kent and Roach and Forsey, It is quite simply the broadest concept of security that has ever been codified into law in Canada, end quote. Second, the scope of sharing is remarkably broad. 17 government institutions with the prospect of expansion will receive this information via cabinet, and more institutions and departments can be added by regulation, not by parliamentary debate, as well as further disclosure to, quote, any person for any purpose, end quote. That's pretty profound. That's a lot of job opportunities on the screen right there. Third, the oversight over public sector privacy has long been viewed as inadequate. In fact, calls for private act reform date back more than 3 decades. The notion that the law is equipped to deal with this massive expansion in sharing personal information is just quite simply not credible. The haste in which this bill is being moved through Parliament, and that amendments are unlikely to be considered in the committee process or at the Senate, suggests that not only will all residents be subject to these provisions, but immigrants who may be perceived to be a potential link to terrorism or public safety and or the economic financial stability of Canada will likely face unprecedented levels of security. If you have confidence with the 17+ government agencies keeping personal information safe and secure and in the right category of good versus bad, consider this example from the United States. In an examination of just 105 records, auditors found that 38% of those records contained errors or inconsistencies that the U.S.'s Terrorist Screening Center's own quality assurance efforts had not found. They also discovered that the TSC is operating 2 versions of the database in tandem without ensuring their contents are identical, which they said could result in missed opportunities to identify terrorists. Now, I recognize what I've been describing here is big picture policy stuff at play for sure. And that does not mean that small actions won't make significant differences. So what's a job counselor to do? Here are 5 things to consider. And I look forward to getting your critique and thoughtful feedback on some next steps. The April session will be an opportunity to revisit these proposals along with phase 2 of this webinar. And critical to this axiom when I lay out these 5 is, remember, bite off what you can chew. The first thing that we can do as job counselors is to document the experiences of those whom we are supporting. If clients are experiencing what may be systemic discrimination, let's document it. Let's move away from the anecdotal to the qualitative and the quantitative. And I'd be very happy to work with others in developing some reporting templates and information gathering tools to allow for a more strategic and comprehensive uniform way of data collection. The second thing that we can do is think about strategic public awareness to tell folks stories. In 2007, we used a similar strategy for a campaign to support temporary migrant workers. We collected individual stories of workers, revealing a pattern of systemic abuse and exploitation. We pitched these stories to the Report on Business for the Globe and Mail, and we got an 11-page color spread that provided one of the first inside views from a wide range of workers, not just farm workers or nannies, about what was taking place with that program. Now, such approaches, of course, have been done in the very popular format of, the doctor we all know who's driving cab right now anecdote. But the point is, it remains a powerful strategy, and more so if the focus is on how insecurity policies are costing the economy in lost human capital. The third thing that we can do is think about targeted advocacy via OCASI, legal clinics, Canadian Council for Refugees, civil liberties associations, the Human Rights and Public Service Commission. As illustrated in this webinar, when OCASI and others filed reports with the UN CERD Committee, it brought increased attention and, importantly, global attention to the consequences of particular policy choices. I'm not naive. This isn't going to solve everything. But it does raise the bar and provides an opportunity to bring into the debate international covenants and instruments that Canada has committed to upholding. Fourth, we need to think about engaging with select employers, industry associations, and municipal allies. The Federation for Canadian Municipalities has issued reports that speak to the important role immigrants have to local economic development. It's important that we engage with these bodies by bringing the cost and consequences of what I've laid out here to their attention. Select employers, industry associations must be approached, and they have to become engaged on this issue because they're losing out on talent, they're facing legal challenges, and they're the ones with a poor public profile. Lastly, we can think about informing and involving representatives from key source countries of the costs and losses that their nationals experience here. I rely on two examples where this tactic was successful. In a previous life, I worked with United Food and Commercial Workers. We invited the Mexican Human Rights Commission to visit Canadian workplaces where their nationals worked on farms. The delegation purposely included representatives from key states where Canada sources newcomers and from across all party lines in Mexico. Upon seeing and interview workers on their job sites, this prominent Mexican agency with a relevant human rights mandate was in a very informed position to begin to lobby directly with the Canadian government about their concerns. That initiative led to 10 union-to-state cooperation agreements to provide better services for Mexican nationals working in Canada. Now, the model might hold some transferable benefits to other workers facing systemic challenges, especially if they are from certain source countries. The other example involved a direct dialogue with senior officials from the U.S. Department of Labor who were unaware of new regulatory changes and the negative impacts that would have on their nationals seeking employment in Canada. That tactic led to a government-to-government exchanges on the policy issue and some modest remedies. Now, no illusions here. A dialogue with the U.S. Department of Labor on ITAR is not going to take us anywhere, but there might be other countries that we might want to think about. So, in conclusion, this proposed 5-point approach is not going to solve all the problems facing economic immigrants. And I acknowledge that taking on this issue is not something that everyone may be comfortable with. And yes, there may be concerns with the fit to respective organizational mandates or even risks to funding. But there is a role for agents to feed their clients' experience to our umbrella bodies, such as OCASI and others, who are better positioned to bring these stories to the media attention and to policymakers' attention. But they can't get that information unless it comes from the ground. Hence the point about data collection. Strategic and coordinated data and story collection, I think, will make a stronger and more informed case about what is happening with newcomers. Also, utilizing our networks and connections to reach out to allies, to employers, to sending countries, to media and parliamentarians can make a difference. So with that, I'll say, bite off only what we can chew. Thanks very much for your time, folks. I hope you found some of these inputs useful in today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Carl. This was quite an inclusive presentation of everything that we shared from, and more, from staff, staff's feedback from last round of regional meetings in October. So very much appreciated. I'd like to now open the Q&A. If you have any questions, please send them via text, questions or comments. We're not going to be able to allow audio for this, and I hope you appreciate it because we are there's quite a few of us online, so it could get quite loud. But anyway, any questions, please forward them to us right now, and we'll read them out loud for Carl to answer. Also, I just wanted to bring another point across. If there are any of you who are viewing this webinar with your colleagues on one login, just tell us how many individuals are with you, just so we can report on the actual numbers. So thanks again. So do we have any questions? Okay, we'll give a few more minutes because it is a texting situation. Any questions at all? Any comments? Or everybody's left speechless.
Looks like that.
Or they went to get coffee.
Oh, there we go. So we have a question. Does OCASI have a way to collect stories?
I have a way to collect stories. That's a great question. I think we're going to have to take that up with OCASI. In the past, I would say yes. When OCASI did the submission to CERD, that information that they got for their report came from individual group members. But I don't believe, and I'll double check this with Amy and with Debbie, on Bill C-51 because of the speed at which it's moving through. I don't know if they currently have a coordinated system, but I'd be happy to follow up with them and maybe see about putting in place a system.
All right, great. Another comment.
Yeah.
Raising any concerns may also have consequences for the initiator through their employers. What do you think of that, Carl?
Yes, without a doubt. I just give the example of Jamie Vargas, the person with Bell Textron. They raising your rights to be able to access the employment opportunity will definitely have a consequence. And I think one of the things that I counsel clients who are in this situation is the likelihood of being able to secure employment in your field after you have filed a human rights complaint against your employer diminishes dramatically. It also means that your name and your resume is probably going to be known in the industry and the sector as the person who took on that company. So Jamie Vargas got a settlement with the Quebec Human Rights Commission, but he's not working in the sector. So there is a very serious cost and consequence. That's why my point about being able to reach out to employers and industry associations is necessary. We need to be able to say to the employers, look, you cannot victimize somebody who's already been victimized once in this particular situation. The industry has to take a look and saying, we've been put into this situation because of ITAR, because of the politics of fear. And it's inappropriate for us to continue to victimizing the workers, plus we're losing it on the talent. But no illusions. An individual who's made their choice to work in the aerospace industry, but because of their country of birth or their international experience, is going to be denied an opportunity even for a job interview. What other choices do they have?
Thank you. Any further comments or questions, please? I don't think I'm getting anything right now except for comments about a very informative and great session. So thank you very much, Carl. I hope that all of you, once you have some time to process all this information, will have some great feedback for us so we can work with Carl on our part 2. So thank you very much all for attending. Thank you very much, Carl, for putting a session together for us. Again, the messages on thank you, very informative, really important information. Thanks for sharing, are all coming in. Thank you, Carl. I'm pleased to see that everybody's gotten the information that they were looking for, and I look forward to working with you, Carl, again on the future session.
That's great.
And,
thanks.
yeah.
Thanks to you and Raj for this. I really appreciate it, and thanks for everybody's attention. And I noticed that there are some men outside of my door with dark sunglasses and black coats. So I think I'll just go with them now.
You never to entertain, but thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. It's Monday, but so what? And we'll see you all again soon. Take care.
Take care. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Carl. And I see a few of them are already looking forward for your part 2. Okay.
Great.
Don't forget the recording will be available on our website. Take care.
All right.
Salute.
Bye-bye.
Bye.